Have you ever experienced this feeling? You sit and study for hours, focusing on each page of the book, each note with colorful underlines, each chapter, each concept. You read and reread until you think you know it by heart. There are nights when you don't sleep, just to review one more time, hoping that the effort will help you be more confident when you enter the exam room. But then, when the test day comes, you sit in front of the test, and suddenly your mind goes blank. The knowledge you thought you knew now seems like it never existed. You try to remember, but the more you try, the more confused you become. A feeling of helplessness rises. You don't understand why you forgot so quickly. Frustration creeps into your mind. You feel disappointed, even as if something is unfair, because you tried. You weren't lazy. You did everything you thought was right, but the results don't reflect that. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Japanese students are still studying, seemingly without any of these problems. They absorb complex knowledge, retain it for a long time, and perform consistently on big exams, not with a frenzy or panic, but with a quiet, patient, and almost absolute discipline. People often look at their results and think they must be naturally smart, or they must have had a special education. But the truth is much simpler and more practical. They do things differently than you. And that difference, you absolutely can learn, even if you feel overwhelmed, frustrated, or have forgotten too much to recall. Before you reach for some new method, some magic technique, there is one truth you need to understand: your brain is not broken. It is not against you. On the contrary, it is working exactly the way it was designed to filter and discard what is not considered essential. This may sound a little hard to accept, but here is the truth: the human brain is programmed to forget. Forgetting is not a mistake. It is an optimal strategy for the brain to avoid being overloaded. In a world where information is constantly and continuously presented, if you memorized everything you have ever seen, read, heard, you would not be able to function properly. Forgetting is the brain's way of protecting you from that confusion. Unless your brain is convinced that a piece of information is truly important and will be used again, it will not retain it for long. That is why you can learn a concept the day before, only to forget it almost completely a day or two later. You are not alone. The German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus described this phenomenon more than a century ago. He calls it the forgetting curve, a graph that shows that most of us will forget about 70% of new information within 24 hours, if not reviewed. And that number continues to increase with each passing day. These numbers are scary, but what's worse is that most people aren't taught about it. We learn, we forget, and then we blame our memory, ourselves, our lack of intelligence, when the truth is that we simply haven't learned it properly. The problem isn't that you're not trying hard enough. It isn't that you're studying for hours, and it isn't that you need to push yourself harder. The problem is that you're studying in a way that goes against the way your brain works. Those Japanese students you admire, they don't study more than you. They study smarter. They use a learning strategy called spaced repetition, a simple yet incredibly effective way to train your brain to remember things deeply, for a long time, and for the right reasons. And the best part is anyone can use this method. Even you. Even if you've tried everything else and failed. And it's here that the difference becomes clear. While most people are still struggling to cram information into their heads in a disjointed, haphazard manner, Japanese students are quietly doing something completely different. They study strategically and periodically. And most importantly, they study at the natural rhythm of their memory. There are no last-minute bursts of intense study, no panic attacks as exam day approaches. Instead, there's persistence. A steady drip of learning, study every day, review every day, with carefully calculated intervals to trick the brain, so that every time it is about to forget, they appear recalling that information, and so the memory is not lost. It is reinforced, repeated just enough to become stable as part of the original memory. The method is called spaced repetition. As the name suggests, it's a technique for repeating information over and over again, not in rapid succession, but at increasingly long intervals. The first time you learn a concept, you review it a few hours later. The next time, a day later, then 3 days later, a week later, a month later. And each time you review it, it's like you're adding new pillars to the foundation of your mental building. The reason this method works isn't so much how many times you repeat it, but when you do it. When you start to feel like you've forgotten but not completely, that's the perfect time to review. When your brain struggles to retrieve a faint memory, it activates deeper neural networks, creating stronger connections between regions of memory. And when you do it over and over again, you not only remember it longer, but you remember it actively, without having to open the book again. In contrast, the way many people still studying continuously, reading the same material over and over again for hours on end, only makes the brain register information as a passive repetition. You feel like you remember it well when you are sitting in front of the book, but in fact it is an illusion brought about by short-term familiarity. Just a few hours later, that knowledge has almost disappeared without a trace. You don't remember it, not because you didn't study, but because you studied it at the wrong time. Surprisingly, Japanese students are introduced to this method from a young age. They don't call it spaced repetition, nor do they need to know the complicated theory behind it. But the way they study, reviewing according to a schedule, not cramming, and always keeping it regular reflects the spirit of this method very well. It's a natural marriage of discipline and psychology. And the best part, it doesn't require you to be smarter than anyone else, nor does it require you to have a superhuman memory. It just requires a small change in your routine instead of studying all at once. Study in short bursts, strategically spaced out. In fact, you don't need to study more. You just need to study smarter and study at the right time. Your brain isn't against you, it's just waiting for you to speak its language. If studying at the right time is like planting seeds in the right season, then the way you review is the soil and water that nourishes those seeds. And here's the thing, most people review in a very passive way. They reread their books, reread their notes, highlight important passages, and think that by reviewing enough times, their memories will take over. Unfortunately, the brain does not work like a photocopier. It does not copy information from a page into memory simply by looking at it over and over again. That is why, even if you read a chapter of a book 10 times, you will still forget it in a day, if you have never actively tried to retrieve it from your memory. And this is where Japanese students do it differently again. Instead of repeating what is familiar, they force their brains to pull the information out, like trying to call the name of an old friend you haven't seen in years. In that moment, your brain is no longer a storage bin. It becomes a search engine. And it is that act of searching, the act of active retrieval, that makes the knowledge stick in your memory. The easiest way to do this is to test yourself. No formal exams required. Just close the book. Look at the title or prompt, and try to rephrase, rewrite, or explain what you learned in your own words. You can use flashcards. You can write the questions down. You can redo the exercises without looking at the answers. Either way, the important thing is you are forcing your brain to act, rather than just receive. At first, this will be much harder than rereading. You will feel confused, make mistakes, and maybe even feel frustrated that you don't remember anything. But that feeling of difficulty is a good sign. In cognitive science, these moments are called desirable difficulties. That is, small obstacles in the learning process do not weaken you, but are the factors that make learning deeper and more sustainable. When you have trouble recalling, your brain has to work harder to restructure the information. And just as muscles get stronger with each load, memories get stronger with each search. That's why the best students, not just in Japan, are often the ones who ask a lot of questions. Not because they don't know, but because they want to make sure they really understand. They don't mind temporarily forgetting, because they know that each time they forget and remember, they are making real progress. They don't look for the feeling of, I know it all when they reread a book, but for the moment of, oh, I don't remember it clearly, I need to review it. And that makes all the difference. The great thing is that you don't need a quiet room, modern technology, or a good teacher to start practicing this. All you need is a blank sheet of paper, or your own imagination. You can test yourself at any time while walking, while washing the dishes, even while waiting for the bus. Think of the lesson as a conversation with yourself. Ask, answer, analyze, paraphrase. The more often you do this, the more you will be amazed at how your ability to remember and understand increases day by day. In other words, don't just study to read, study to talk back. When you can explain an idea in your own words, whether to someone else or to yourself. You are not just remembering the knowledge, you are owning it. Once we understand that memory is not built by passive reception, but by retrieval and struggle, we can see clearly why the Japanese take notes so differently. They don't take notes to get it all down, but to organize, to see the essence. And more importantly, to be able to recall easily later. It is not uncommon to see Japanese students taking notes that are not long-winded or ornate like artistic paintings on paper. They are not designed to impress, but to actually serve the purpose of learning. They are short, concise, and use a clear structure key information, suggested questions, and a summary, all designed to be read back in 5 minutes and understand everything again. Some students use the Cornell method, dividing the page into 3 sections on the left for questions or keywords, in the middle for the main content, and at the bottom for summarizing in their own words. Others choose a simpler approach, dividing the page into vertical columns, each with a main idea, accompanied by small drawings or icons for easy reference. The colors are used not to decorate, but to differentiate one color for definitions, one color for examples, one color for mistakes to avoid. All of this is geared toward a single goal to help you review easily without having to reread entire chapters, without having to rely on short-term memory. Notes become a tool for reactivating knowledge, not a place to store all the information. And because of this clarity, Japanese students can review dozens of chapters in a single evening, not because they learn faster, but because they prepare to review more intelligently from the start. Their notes are not the product of instantaneous memory, but part of a strategic learning system study. Write, retrieve, and reinforce repeated in a disciplined cycle. But what most people don't realize, the quietest but perhaps most important factor of all, is not the technique of memorization, but the way they approach learning. Japanese learning culture does not encourage sprinting. They don't wait until the last minute to dive into their studies, nor do they treat learning as a chore to be completed in a panic. Instead, they stick to a regular rhythm, repeated every day. 10 minutes a day, if maintained consistently, will create a much deeper and more lasting memory than 5 stressful hours on the weekend. That persistence creates what neuroscientists call long-term retention, where knowledge is no longer floating around in short-term memory, but is stored in the deep layers of the brain, ready to be retrieved at any time. And finally, there's one more tool the Japanese use, and you might be surprised they teach what they've learned, whether it's just to themselves or to an imaginary friend. This action, called explanatory retrieval, is one of the most powerful ways to master knowledge. When you try to explain a concept, your brain is forced to organize all the disparate information into a coherent, logical flow. You find gaps, you connect the dots, and you gain a deeper understanding of what you thought you knew. If you've ever thought that you don't have a good memory, or that your brain isn't built for learning, maybe the problem isn't you, it's how you approach learning. Memory isn't a gift, it's a skill. And any skill can be developed if you approach it the right way. Learning isn't a race to see who studies harder or stays up later. It's a journey to understand how your brain works and to adjust your learning strategy to match it. That's when you realize that memorization isn't a chore. It's a rhythm. It's not a battle with yourself, but a collaboration between you and your brain. When you experience that, when learning stops being a compulsion and becomes a synchronicity, everything changes. Not just your grades, not just your ability to remember, it's how you see yourself. You're no longer a forgetful person, but a rememberer. You are no longer a chaser of knowledge, but a master of it. And once you feel that, the feeling of learning without getting tired, reviewing without worrying, remembering without stress, you will understand that effective learning is not a secret. It is understanding yourself, and that anyone can achieve, starting today,